Good afternoon, folks, and thanks for coming. My name is Rob Eyler. I'm an economist, and I want to thank AFWD for sponsoring this event to talk about Plumas County and really talk about the entire economy. That's going to be context for what I'll talk about with respect to Plumas. So, just to get started, two things. One is that you please use the chat box if you have any questions, and the second is that I'm going to do all the questions at the end. So, as we're going, if you do think of something, please put it in there, and I'll take care of you. And then I'll give you my contact information at the end, just in case you think of something later. So, folks, over the next 12 months, economists are looking at the following items as sort of the focal points of where we think, how we think things are going to get shaped in terms of the economy and its recovery to the end of 2021. First, we have a new administration in town, and they have a lot of spending on their docket, and we will see how much they get through the split Congress. But they already have started spending, and the supposition is they're going to keep on doing that. So one of the things to watch going forward is how we see the Biden White House providing more pressure on Congress, and how the economy puts also more pressure on Congress to do one of two things: either have fiscal stimulus round three, or have some type of investment or some mix. And it's in the investment that most economists think we get the most economic action, but we know there's going to be a lot of political pressure and probably some economic pressure to provide another round of stimulus. Well, we waited some time, but we did get that next round of stimulus, what we call fiscal stimulus round two. And that money starting to hit the street and starting to help people, especially at lower income levels. And we're going to talk a lot off and on today about lower income level individuals. But the bottom line is that as those checks come and they get spent, they basically act as a bridge over troubled water. They're not necessarily investment in the future of our economy, or really what you could think of as true expansionary fiscal policy. That comes with investment. But the really only way that the government can feel like it can invest prudently and not focus on providing that sort of bridge over troubled water is to make sure that we have the economy turning and recovering in the correct fashion. Well, the main way that's going to happen now is to get those caseloads of COVID-19 down, and vaccines that are on the move toward you, if you haven't already got your shot, they should be coming over the next few months. The trick is just getting it out there and allowing the turn of the corner with respect to both our social interactions and the medical science to work to provide better business confidence and ultimately better consumer confidence. We will need those two working hand in hand for one to start hiring, the other one to start spending, and then to feed off of each other as a virtuous cycle going forward. So that's something we've been waiting on as well. And now we think we have a path and a plan to walk on. We just need to see that efficacy rise and the caseloads go down. Unfortunately, the economy has hurt our lower wage income groups more than anything. And so that group, that socioeconomic group that mainly resides in the most hurt industries, are starting to demand more social services, more services from nonprofit organizations, including food banks. This is the picture you see here. And it's something to watch over time because it's a continued challenge that we're not going to easily conclude on anytime soon. Unfortunately, it's going to take at least an additional year for those folks to completely recover, even if the economy itself is getting close to full recovery. Well, one way to track how we're recovering is to look at the total number of unemployed people and look and see the transitions in how people become unemployed. These are the data from January 2007 forward on a monthly basis, and these are temporary job losses. And you can see, if you look at the far right-hand side, that there was a big spike in the number of people who were temporarily put out of work, at least initially, by their employers, with the idea that you would probably see some of those workers come back to work as soon as the social constraints were lifted after March and April really, in a sense, bottled up our economy for a couple of months. Now, you can easily see in these data that we saw it start to slip down, and that's partially labor market recovery. Unfortunately, that's mirrored against the permanent job losers who typify normal recession. So this is not a normal recession because of so many temporary workers leading the charge. But now the permanent work or the permanent loss of jobs is starting to take over the total number of unemployed. Now, part of the temporary job loss, as I said earlier, has now converted to permanent job loss, but these are also new job losses, not just conversion. And the more blue that area gets, the more trouble there is in getting full recovery achieved. The other ways people lose their jobs or become part of the unemployed ranks is to complete a temporary job, to leave their job voluntarily or quit, to re-enter the labor force but not quite have a job yet. And one of the nuances of this recession and ultimate recovery is that we did see people elect to walk away from the labor force to take care of kids because of a lack of childcare and a lack of schools being physically opened, who are now slowly migrating back into the workforce because they're starting to see their schools adjust or their childcare adjust, or just making internal adjustments at home to balance out with a partner. Either way, that amount of people coming back in adds to the unemployed and is a good sign that people see confidence in jobs coming, but adds a little bit more to the stack. And then finally, new entrants, high school and college graduates primarily. So that rainbow color on the right-hand side is suggesting there's a little bit more trouble brewing in the labor market in the short term, but we want to see all those colors start to move closer to zero over the next year or so. And hopefully, as we get through the beginning portions of this year, there'll be enough continued economic momentum, enough reduction in caseloads to lift a lot of the continued social constraints, and we'll get people back to work. But these, as you can see, the total height of all those in as of December 2020 and really just the 1st of January 2021 is about 3/4 the height of the peak of the Great Recession unemployment levels. Let's look industrially at the national level now to see where most of the pain has been. And these aren't going to probably shock you if you've been following what's been going on locally and statewide and nationally with respect to job loss, but the far right-hand side is where most of the damage has happened. Other services, places like hair salons and nail salons, food services and drinking places, bars and restaurants, and accommodation, hotels and gathering places, and event places, and mainly all three of those are where people either gather or are relatively close to who's ever providing them with services. So you can see those cuts were relatively big in April, and that's where most of the initial damage happened in the labor market. Now I'm going to zoom right over to November at the national level, and you can see a lot of those numbers pick back up. So they started very negative and then got closer to that red dotted line. And the idea is to get those bars over the red dotted line and actually moving up. And we're not quite there yet looking back 1 year. And now here's December giving some of that momentum back. So let me stop here and explain a couple things about what these data represent. Let's look at the far right-hand side with respect to accommodation. That number, negative 32.1%, means that compared to December 2019, 32.1% of the folks who had a job in December 2019 are out of work who were working for hotels and motels. So a little over 3 out of 10. For restaurants and bars, that's about 1 out of 5. So what these are a look back 1 full calendar year, same month, and what happened to the total number of jobs that were hired in that industry category. And you can see that there's still some relatively high numbers if you think about 1 year having a fifth or almost a third of the jobs that were there now lost. That's a lot of people out of work, assuming they don't get back somewhere in the economy. Now the trick, and this is why it connects back to the first slide when I showed you this and talked about lower wage workers, those buckets are places where people have easy entry and exit from those jobs, and thus they're relatively lower wage. So as those industries remain hurting, our lower wage workers are going to have a hard time getting back to work, generally speaking. What I want to do now is I want to compare the evolution of the current recession and ultimate recovery with the Great Recession. And I think it's important to do this because it gives you a perspective on how quickly things have changed in the last 12 months versus the Great Recession, which had a lot of pain, but took a much longer time to roll out toward its bottom. Well, here's the way we're going to do this is we're going to put November 2007 and January 2020 at the same starting place, converting the total number of workers into an index number starting at both of those dates equal to 100, and then watch the evolution of jobs under both scenarios. So here's the evolution under the Great Recession. So as jobs started to fall away as the Great Recession began, basically after November 2007 is where economists have sort of tracked and dated the beginning of the job downturn. You can see that sort of big blue bowl emerge where it bottoms out about 26 to 28 months later, then starts to gradually rise up to where it matches the total number of jobs that were there in November 2007, about 76 months later. So it took that long to go from a certain amount of jobs back to that same amount of jobs. That's a long time to not have any job growth. Well, the current recession looks like this. So a much sharper drop, a much faster pace back up, but then this curl effect. So the one thing that economists are concerned about is that we don't want that curl to turn into a bowl like we saw with the Great Recession. We want it to keep going up toward that red dotted line, where maybe it's just taking a slight right turn for the time being, and then we'll keep on going. And as we'll see later, most forecasts believe that's exactly what's going to happen. However, there's still some threat that it will flatten a little bit or a little bit longer than we're expecting. That's why we've got to make sure that whatever we do from a fiscal policy standpoint with respect to either fiscal stimulus 3 or with governmental investment, that we do it in such a way that really stimulates jobs growth, because this picture, especially for the Great Recession, really tells a story about how long it took our economy to revive from the Great Recession. And from this recession, we've had some strong momentum in the third and fourth quarters of the year, last December 2020. We need to keep that going. Well, our equity markets have really shook off most of that bad labor market news last year and really did not go down for very long, even though when it was falling, it felt like it was in full free fall. Now, here are the last 3 recessions, and these data represent the S&P 500 index on a monthly basis from January 2000 to the end of 2020. And you can see I've shaded the 3 recession dates since the year 2000, where we have the dot-com recession as the first shaded date, and you can see the slow slide down of the financial markets to the bottom, and then going up in the bull market from 2 decades ago. Then the sharp downturn in the Great Recession down to that bottom, which is marked at number 735. Then this long bull market in the 2010s that we're still part of right now, but there have been some sharp, violent movements in the data, especially in 2020. And you can see that where it says 2652 is where the S&P 500 bottomed out during March and April, and then has been growing ever since with a couple of hiccups in between, but not much. 2 major reasons why our equity markets have shook off what's going on in labor markets. The first one, we have relatively low interest rates again, an almost immediate reaction by the Federal Reserve to a coming recession that it knew it was coming. And one of the funny things about this recession is that basically the politics were in full control of how large or small the immediate impact of the recession was by how constrained social interactions and business availability was going to be. So we knew it was going to happen. We knew lowering interest rates was going to provide some bridge over troubled water for folks that were willing to engage in credit markets, but also for businesses who were willing to borrow to sort of stay afloat until we turned the corner and released ourselves from the social constraints. And the equity markets bought into that idea that we were going to return very quickly. And of course, the quasi V-shaped recovery initially helped to do that. That little hiccup on the way between 2652 and 3690 was because we started to see a little bit of slowdown in the summer, and then we took it right back off again. The second piece is that the major tech companies that drive this index have seen enormous changes in revenue because our lives have become like this, have become more virtual. The other piece of the financial side of the house is in debt. So one of the concerns economists had going into this recession is that people were going to live more on their credit cards and just more on credit, period, regardless of what that may look like, because they weren't going to have income coming in. But the 2 rounds of fiscal stimulus and enhanced unemployment insurance benefits have helped keep people away from running to their credit cards to survive, like they have in past recessions. So it sort of staved off, at least for the time being, a lot of the financial market damage that can come when people are making panic decisions about how they're going to spend money. Well, the main way in which households hold debt is in their homes. So these data are quarterly from 2003 to 2020 quarter 3, and they show in inflation adjusted terms the total amount being borrowed by households. So this is just mortgage debt. And you can see the big run up to the beginning of the Great Recession, then a slow slide downhill as people lost their homes, and we saw restructuring of debt across the board, and then much slower growth this last decade as people learned a lesson and were somewhat reticent to jump back in, but for low interest rates. Here's home equity lines of credit. Here's auto loans, and here's credit cards. So this is where we thought the last 2 columns on the far right-hand side, the second and third quarters of 2020, we'd see some surging use of credit markets. Didn't really happen. And the reason I'm using inflation-adjusted dollars here is because borrowing money 12 years ago is much different value than borrowing money today. So we wanted to show the decline in the value of money locking a certain date in place. We're still below the peak of the debt cycle in inflation-adjusted terms as of the third quarter of 2020 versus the third quarter of 2008. Here's student lending and other lending vehicles. So one of the things to think about is that we have not run to debt markets yet. But the reason I also show you this is because this is another place to monitor how we're actually getting through recovery, especially as we start to see a fade of payment deferments by banks and credit unions in terms of people staying in their mortgages, credit cards not giving as many deferments either, and all the sort of help starting to fade as the recovery starts to slowly show its face. And it's a timing thing. Well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just published its forecast for the entire global economy, and the United States is part of this forecast, obviously, as well. And they call it out as a line item that's in the shaded area here. That 2020 was probably going to be negative growth of about 3.4, 3.5%, but that the 2021 is going to be a very positive year, historically speaking, 5.1 annually. That's very robust growth on average for an entire year, but then moderating to something that looks a little bit more pre-COVID, about 2.5% per year. And this is the growth of after or so-called inflation-adjusted real income growth for the economy. It's driven by employment. So those kind of numbers tell you that places like the IMF, and most economists agree for the time being because of the data we have and our expectations going forward, that we don't see a double dip. We don't see 2021 or 2022 as times where we're going to recess again, but we need a smooth recovery to really achieve those current projections for growth. Well, all that is context. That affects what goes on in California and even a place like Plumas County. So what I want to show you now are a bunch of data that show the state and local level for Plumas and kind of give some perspectives on what's going on regionally as well. So these data are labor market data for California, Plumas County, Butte County, and Sacramento County as a way of seeing all around the state and what's going on. California is at 8.8% unemployment, up from November because we had social constraints that slowed down our labor market activity in December. These negative numbers, other than the unemployment rate, are looking back 1 year. So these are comparing December 2019 to December 2020, things we've done when we looked at the national level 10 minutes ago. If you look at Plumas County, which is the second set of columns, in the middle here, you'll see that the labor market has dropped by about 2.7%, similar percentage change to the state. Not a whole lot of people because of the rural nature and the small population and the small working population in Plumas County, but 10.7% unemployment. Butte County doing a little better than that and a little better than the state, and Sacramento doing relatively well also. Now, these data suggest that Plumas County still got some ways to go, still hurting a little bit, but generally speaking, like the other parts of the state in terms of the number of people coming back and getting back to work. Let's now look at California and do some comparisons, and then we'll dig a little deeper into Plumas. Same picture we saw before with respect to the recovery. Whoops, I hit the wrong button. I apologize. Same data we looked at with respect to recovery at the national level, but now we're going to look at it at the state level. Here's California in the Great Recession. So you can see that blue bowl also here, just like at the national level, recovered a little bit more quickly to get back to where we started the recession. And this is what the COVID-19 recession looks like. So same V shape, down, relatively quick recovery, but that right leg of the V starting to flatten out a little bit and then get that curl at the end. Same deal. We need that black line to move up toward the red line. If we get that going, continue recovery in California. If we don't, it flattens out. It's going to start to take on somewhat similar characteristics. And that's why this is a nice comparison, because the global integration and the nature of our economy make this recession and the Great Recession really the best comparatives. It's great to have a glass of wine in your hand and say, oh, this is just like the 1919 recession. Well, short of economic historians, there's really nobody on planet Earth anymore who truly remembers that recession that wrapped itself around the Spanish flu. So while it's fun to talk about that in terms of big history takes, these are really the best comparisons. So we need that black line going towards the red dotted line. In a similar fashion, if you look at the industrial breakdown of job losses since 2019, looking at the same month in 2020, here's April. So this is the percentage change in the number of jobs that were there April 2019 to April 2020. You noticed leisure and hospitality, which is now putting together bars, restaurants, and hotels and event spaces where people tend to gather. That's a sharp downturn, almost 50% down in April for the previous April. Other services, hair salons, nail salons, again, down almost 30%. And then an array of other changes for other industries. But then recovery started to happen. Here's May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and then December gave back some of that momentum. So you'll notice for leisure and hospitality, still about 3 out of 10 workers who had a job December 2019 out of work at the end of last year, and about 1 in 5 for other services. Relatively similar to the national levels, relatively similar. But other industries have shown slightly better recovery. Some of those industries were so-called essential industries. It helped them out in terms of those workers remaining in their jobs. But the bottom line is that those low-wage workers are concentrated in those still heavily damaged industries. Well, let's look at a forecast now of where California might be going. These data are quarterly from 2005 forward, and they accompany the governor's budget when it's released, and that was just released a couple of weeks ago, coming out of the Department of Finance here in California. Well, this covers the Great Recession, which is that shaded area you now see. You can see that hill was climbed in terms of the total number of workers, and then you see the fall during the recession. These data are all triggered to that same date, November 2007, to compare not only the recovery from the Great Recession, but also where we've gone and where we may be going in the COVID-19 recession, which is shown here in this shaded area. Notice that after the V is over and we start to get through the first quarter of 2021, not only do we foresee the recession ending, we expect there's going to be an announcement that the recession technically ended in the fourth quarter of 2020 relatively soon. The National Bureau of Economic Research does that for the American economy, and we should hear that in the next quarter or so. But then after that, we expect a smooth ride up to where we actually get back to the volume of workers we had pre-COVID. Now let's think about that. That timeline, we just saw what the Great Recession looked like. Now we see it's going to maybe take 5 years to go from January 2020 job levels to the same level at the end of 2024. Wow. So that's somewhat similar to the Great Recession, short of all the sort of dynamics and violent movement of the jobs data in the in-between. But as long as we smoothly continue to go up, and we might get lucky, we might see that slope go a little quicker, that would help a lot. But either way, we are in recovery mode, assuming we get these caseloads down and things are looking better every day. Just need to see that go forward and see people get their jobs back. Okay, now let's look at Plumas County. Same deal. Here is the Great Recession, and unfortunately, like a lot of parts of rural California, especially northeastern rural California, Plumas County did not recover to the same volume of jobs it had before the Great Recession. Part of that is because the economy locally that was built up, not I wouldn't say on a farce, but was built up in a way that when job losses came, those jobs just simply never came back. And it left a hole in the economy that was never really refilled. But you can also see, unfortunately, the latest recession, because of that lack of recovery, we don't have an end time yet to getting back to the previous or the volume of workers before the Great Recession. And here is the COVID-19 recession to show you. Now, the cool thing is that for Plumas County, at least as of December 2020, we don't have that same hook effect on the far end. So for Plumas County, it's still sort of in a trajectory and moving up toward that red line, which is great. And part of that's also a reflection of rural California. There's a few counties around northeastern California that have very similar dynamics, never really recovered from the Great Recession, but are on a pretty good trajectory, at least right now, of getting back to that red dotted line, maybe a little bit more quickly than other places. Got to keep that momentum going. Here's an industrial look at Plumas. Same deal we just looked at it in California. And here we go. There's April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and you can start to see some positive numbers emerging, especially on the farming side, which is pretty amazing. And then there's December. So one of the things about this is you'll notice that there's information, which is a relatively small number of people. Information is software and publishing and a bunch of other sort of like cable networks and those kind of things. Like think of Xfinity or DirecTV workers in Plumas County. Still down quite a bit. A lot of that could be because there's just been a slowdown in publishing more than anything else of the local paper, or they've just slowed down hiring because of lack of revenues. You can see though, leisure and hospitality down a little over 1/3, even though there's been some positives in terms of those professional and business services as well as education. It's been a tough year in certain categories. But as we said earlier, Plumas is starting to continue to, or I shouldn't say, it's continuing its momentum that started middle last year, It just needs to keep going. What these data also show is where to direct economic and workforce development assets in terms of picking up either lost workers who are still out of jobs in these categories, especially leisure and hospitality and other services, but also businesses who may be teetering on the edge of not remaining in business, which can exacerbate these negative numbers. Even though for right now, some of these look pretty good, it doesn't mean that these businesses that hire folks in these categories are going to remain around forever if this slow economy continues. Let's now look at housing and see if we what's going on with respect to median home prices. So you can see in Plumas County, we see about 3% growth in the last 12 months, a little bit more than the last 24, which means most of the housing price growth has happened just in the last 12 months. And this may be in your mind somewhat counterintuitive. We just went through a recession, and let's say it gets declared over. In the last few recessions, housing really took a hit on the nose, if you will, where this one doesn't look like it's going to happen. Well, two things are going on. One, we didn't build as much housing as we had in the previous 3 cycles leading up to the recession. So that helped slow down a lot of the initial problems that come with recession because we didn't have as much supply as we did demand. And demand was rising quickly for 2 major reasons. One, interest rates were down and have remained down since since April 2020. And the second is you have still relatively high rental prices out there where if houses do go up and the credit conditions are really good, demand wants to take advantage of those and jump in and buy. So for right now, as we'll see in a second also, the outlook the last 12 months look pretty good for Northeastern California and really around California in terms of median home prices. The opportunity cost of this growth, unfortunately, is to exacerbate housing equity issues and a housing crisis in terms of making it affordable for folks at lower and middle income levels. If you look at the forecast that's out there, this is coming from Zillow research, and generally speaking, this is a forecast that's very reflective of what most housing economists see over the next 12 months. The next 12 months look pretty strong, no matter where you are in California, but the critical factor is how well we recover. We know interest rates are going to be relatively low, so the credit conditions are going to be good, but if people feel underconfident about full economic recovery and ultimately jobs recovery, that's where some problems are going to start to show up in the housing market in terms of having continued positive growth. But if we have a 15 or 17% average growth across California over a 2-year stretch, people have got to be happy with that, even if it starts to slow down in terms of growth. Okay, let's now look at that job split between high wage workers and low wage workers I've alluded to a couple of times. This is being characterized as so-called K-shaped recovery, where high wage workers, in this case due to national comparisons, are workers that make a minimum of $60,000 a year. And low wage workers are characterized here as those that make a maximum of $27,000 a year. Since January 2020 for California, we're almost flat in terms of overall growth of the high wage workers. The low wage workers might be as much as 28% unemployed, which in the middle is basically where the current unemployment rate is. So one of the things we're concerned about is that split remaining as a long-term issue for California. What are we going to do from a social services standpoint? Because we know that as that continues, if that green line at the bottom does not start to move up towards zero, then some problems show up. Local government has rising social services demand and puts more of a pinch on budgets. Nonprofit organizations have a larger pinch on their budget because they also are seeing rising demand against maybe not as many revenues. Multifamily units, if you're an apartment owner and you've been renting, will your renters stay in place if they're low or middle wage workers? This has been a big question mark throughout the recession period so far as to whether or not we're going to see a surge in vacancies if people start to leave or basically walk away from their current rental situation and potentially leave the area, which would leave demand behind. Finally, if you do see people out migrate from your local area, what does that mean with respect to rehiring? How does that change the local labor market, especially in leisure and hospitality and other services that tend to bring in people at relatively low wages as far as workers are concerned? So there's a lot of questions brewing if we don't get these two lines closer to each other in terms of getting those lower wage workers employed relatively quickly. For small business, this is the look for California, and these data all come, the last slide and this slide all come from a database called tracktherecovery.org, which is a partnership between Harvard University and the Gates Foundation to try to gather whatever data is out there from big data sources, from classic data sources, push them all together and say, can we track as many places around the economy in the United States as we can to try to figure out how we're recovering? So one metric they're looking at or trying to estimate are the number of small businesses, which they define as businesses with a maximum of 500 workers. For California, that means generally about 25 workers or less. And how many of those businesses remain open? Well, from January 2020 going forward, this is their estimated evolution of the number of small businesses as defined that have remained open or not. This is actually negative because there are fewer businesses open than have closed. So for California overall, about 37% of the businesses that were open in 2020 have now closed, and almost half of the businesses who were in leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, and event areas where we gather for things like concerts, are closed. Almost half. Wow. And this is as of the end of December. If you think about that, how does that affect rehiring if those are permanent closures? The problem with these data is we don't know if they're permanent or temporarily closed. So that's something to watch going forward as well. And now I want to show you is the total small business outlook that they're estimating for Butte County, Tehama County, and Plumas County. This shows you regionally, things have evolved somewhat similarly, even though in Plumas County, we saw a little bit more opening in the summer because the more rural California you were in, the more open your local area tended to be. But by the end of December, they're all kind of coalescing around the same point, which is around 40%. And you can see it in those numbers on the far right-hand side. Now, again, these are reflective only of estimated data, and we don't know if they're permanent or temporary closures, but they start to beg some questions. What? Well, we see a loss of regional restaurants and hotels if the concentration of business closures and potentially permanent closures are in leisure and hospitality industries. 2, what's that leave in the wake in terms of the costs of engaging in buying services from those industries? Will restaurant prices go up? Will it be a higher cost for tourists to come in and stay at hotels because now the competition has shrunk? It's something to watch across all industries, even just getting a contractor. How much more expensive is that going to be? And then the cost of operation. So if these are temporarily closed businesses, and let's say they all are, will the cost of operating on the other side of the 1st of January 2021, especially once all the social constraints start to get lifted, will it be too much for people to stay in business, even if they've tried to hang on by their fingernails for the last 12 months or so, and they've used things like PPP, EIDL, and all these sort of government vehicles to stay in business? We'll see. But it's something to watch again from an economic and workforce development standpoint. How do these data, how do they really reflect what's going on the ground in places like Plumas County? And what can you do from an economic and workforce development standpoint to direct resources to help businesses that you believe are not just to stay open now, but will remain open for years to come if you help them today? That's really the friction. Most of the help thus far has been blanket help rather than targeted help. And from an economic standpoint, that's a little tricky. Okay, let's now look at the evolution of the population in Plumas County to get a sense of what's been going on with the base population and some things to think about. Here's births and deaths in Plumas County. As just like most of rural California, Plumas County has aged a little bit over the last 20 years. These data are annual fiscal year data from 1999-2000 to just June 30, 2020. So we're starting to get the beginnings of COVID-19 on the far right-hand side. But the point is that the natural decrease in the population that you see here is usually because of an aging population, again, generally true around the state of California and our rural areas. There's a very little bit of net foreign inbound to Plumas County, but it's in migration patterns around the country coming in from other places and also leaving to other places where most of the additional dynamics jump in. And this is the change over time. So Plumas County hasn't seen an enormous change in the total population, but it's been up and down, especially the last 5 or 6 years. Some of that might be fire fear, actual fire, just concerns about where we're going to go in the future with respect to the local economy. But either way, population change, the main thing that this does is start to change the composition of the local labor force, including school attendance. So our local officials in education start to get nervous the more that families leave and more senior workers come into the area, or just folks that are retired. Okay, so what are we going to watch thinking about the economy going forward? Expect interest rates to remain relatively low. even if we see economic growth, it's not going to be that big of a change on interest rates. We should expect home prices to remain relatively frothy in terms of growth as long as recovery conditions and low rates remain in place. And what we should also be watching very closely is the migration of people from urban areas to suburban and rural places of California that are relatively connected, with the idea they might be porting their job with them. That can affect economic development locally in a bunch of different ways, especially if the demands for local services change because of a changing population. We'll see if that actually holds true. We've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that that has happened. Whether it's happened or not will play out over the next year or so. This K-shaped versus V-shaped recovery. If we don't get jobs generally coming back and we don't lift the social constraints that we're still living under for most of California, those lower wage workers are not going to come back to work sooner or very soon, certainly against the higher wage workers. And that's going to start to hurt local budgets. A local nonprofit demand is going to remain still relatively high for those services that they provide. And it's just going to leave this hole in our local economies until it's filled. Our urban areas are much more at risk. The Los Angeles area is the worst labor market in California right now because it's got this double whammy of loss of entertainment jobs and tourism simultaneously that have a lot of different effects on the regional area in LA. The public sector, because of all those pieces and because we haven't had as many transactions happening over the last 12 months, are waiting for funding, hopefully to rotate from the federal government. But if they don't get it, only economic recovery is really going to help those areas. And they're very concerned about the lessons learned from the last couple of recessions, where some cities and counties in California got very, very close to the edge of bankruptcy because they just didn't have enough revenues to cover their costs. And at a time where revenues have remained relatively flat, even though housing prices remaining stable have helped property tax revenues remain stable, we got to watch our cities and counties to see if the economic recovery and federal money come in to stabilize decisions about jobs in government, and thus the volume of social services that could actually be provided. At the household and business and governmental level, watching and managing debt is a big deal. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but one of the big questions I get is how much federal debt can we really take on? And the answer is as much as the global economy is willing to purchase. But at some point, if you're not smart about it, you will create conditions of permanently increasing interest rates and not allowing yourself a lot of flexibility from a monetary policy standpoint. And second, you'll create potential conditions of inflation because the value of your currency is going to get smaller. So what the American economy is trying to do is get through this period. The global economy is still soaking up our financial instruments, but we have to watch carefully of how that starts to affect things like Social Security, Medicare, and our ability to finance deficits later on down this decade by doing too much debt financing now. That's also true in our homes and for our businesses. So it's going to be a very wild year. Plumas County looks pretty good for right now in terms of main momentum, but it's got some industries that it really needs to watch out for. And it's such a small rural economy that a little bit can mean a lot, but just be cautious to move those assets where you have the best long-term bets. If I don't get to your question, folks, here's my contact information. It's right there is my email, eyler@econforensics.com, and then my Twitter handle is @Bobby7007. Hit me up and follow me if you'd like. I know I saw some chat here. Let me look and see. What is included in farming is everything that's agricultural. So that includes cannabis in theory, but it includes everything that would be farming, natural resources. So forestry work would also be in there. And I don't see any other questions. And Guy, I hope that helped answer your question. I'm going to give it about 30 seconds, folks. If you have anything you'd like to type in there, this would be a great time. And again, if I don't get to something that you suddenly think of after we're done, email me. But folks, otherwise, thank you so much. And please stay safe out there. I know the last night was pretty crazy with the storms, and make it a great year. Take care.